Welcome to The Road to Super Smash Bros., the show where we look at all of the characters' journeys up to the 1999 hit game. In this week's episode, we will finish 1982. Last week, we saw the creation of two of Nintendo's franchise characters, Donkey Kong and Super Mario. We saw their two games that they did together at the arcade, Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., as well as the handheld port of Donkey Kong on both the Nintendo Game & Watch and the Coleco Mini Arcade. This week, we're going to take a look at their debuts in the home market. Donkey Kong had proven to be a massive success at the arcade, and many companies were vying for the rights to publish the game on their home consoles. Nintendo was looking for a suitor because they didn't yet have a home console of their own, other than the first generation, and they were still trying to increase their name recognition in the United States. Ultimately, it was decided that Coleco was the hungriest company, and an agreement was reached to allow Coleco to release Donkey Kong on the brand new ColecoVision. The system would come out in August of 1982, and Donkey Kong would be packed in with the console. The ColecoVision, although listed as a second-generation console, is actually probably the first third-generation console. It is vastly superior to those systems that had come before it, and as we look at these comparisons of Donkey Kong home release, we'll see how much better it is than the others. Despite this, home consoles still could not compare to the arcade, so the graphics are way worse than what you would see on the arcade version. That said, the characters are clearly defined and the foreground images are quite clear as well. In order to deal with the screen differences between the arcade and the television, Coleco would remove a tier from each stage. So instead of climbing up 6 different levels of a girder, there's only 5. The first stage is duplicated pretty accurately other than that missing tier. But because of that, it causes Donkey Kong to appear on the right side of the screen as he hurls barrels at Mario instead of the traditional left side of the screen. Mario can still jump over the barrels and still climbs up the ladders, and there are still hammers available to try to destroy the barrels with as he tries to get to the top of the screen. If he does that, the game moves on to the next level. It skips the second stage from the arcade, the conveyor belt stage, and goes straight to the third stage, the elevator stage. Again, it is condensed in height to make up for the differences between an arcade and a home television. Another big change is that towards the end, Mario must avoid springs in the arcade, but here in this version, they use fireballs like you will find in the final level instead. And after getting to the top, you move on to the final stage. Again, it is 1 tier shorter than that you would find in the arcade. Instead of removing 8 girders, you only remove 6. This time around, too, interestingly enough, where the girders had all been pink before, they remain pink in this one. Where in the arcade, they were blue. So an interesting color switch here. All of the cutscenes are missing because, again, it's a home arcade, except you do get the final cutscene in which you see Donkey Kong fall to the ground and Mario and Pauline get to unite together. And you win the game. Of course, the game continues on, and your goal is to score as many points as possible, just as if it were in the arcade. Now, Coleco would take the opportunity after having gained the license from Nintendo to publish this game also for its competitors, Atari and the Intellivision. This possibly was done to demonstrate the superior quality of the ColecoVision. As you'll see here, it's definitely the best of these versions. First, we'll take a look at the Intellivision. The system was nearly 3 years old, having been released in 1979. When you go to the first level, you can already see the colors are awful. Each character is just a single color. Donkey Kong appears in this brownish green color. Pauline matches the background, so in the first stage she's pink, and in the second stage she's blue. Mario's face is different than his body. Now, the character models are terrible, but the foreground graphics, as you'll see later, are better than what Atari brings, at least. So even though they don't match the ColecoVision, the foreground graphics are at least somewhat tolerable. You can tell what the girders are supposed to be. You can actually read the word oil on the barrel. In this game, only 2 stages are present, the equivalent to the first and final stages in the arcade. So it skips the conveyor belt stage, as the ColecoVision had done, but it also skips the elevator stage. In the first stage, they again shortened it by 1 tier, just as they had chosen to do on the ColecoVision. There are no cutscenes in this game at all. You don't even get to see Mario unite with Pauline when you remove the last rivet from the girders. Instead, the game just starts back up over at the beginning as you try to earn as many points as possible. Now, we'll take a look at the Atari 2600, which the system itself originally came out in 1977, so now we're dealing with a 5-year-old system when this game comes out. The game lacks a title screen. Instead, you begin immediately on the first level. This time around, the character sprites are vastly superior to that of the Intellivision. It's much easier to see what the characters are supposed to be, but the foreground suffers for it. The girders and the ladders look terrible. It's impossible to read the word oil on the barrel. Now that said, the first stage comes out pretty well. They did include all 6 tiers, so it resembles the arcade game in that manner. It makes it, in that sense, the most accurate to the game, as Mario has to try to again climb up the ladders and get to the top. Once he does that, you go immediately to the second stage, which again is the equivalent to the final stage in the arcade. So again, it is missing the 2 middle stages. Now it's here that you really see the weaknesses of the Atari. The second stage does not resemble the arcade version in any way, shape, or form. Instead of going kind of in a pyramid fashion where each girder is slightly smaller, all the girders are the same length. There are 2 rivets to remove from each one. The fireballs this time around, though, cannot go up and down the ladders. Instead, they just go back and forth across the screen in a pattern. And you must try to time yourself and try to trap the fireballs in the right place that will allow you to continue up the ladders to the top. Again, once you get all the rivets removed, there is no cutscene, and you just start back over at the beginning, trying to earn as many points as possible. And so we've seen Mario and Donkey Kong make their home appearance with 3 different versions of the game Donkey Kong. They would be back, and the game will have more home ports to show for it later. But for now, before the year comes to an end, we're going to take a look at the first port of Donkey Kong Jr. On October 26th, Nintendo would release Donkey Kong Jr. on a widescreen version of the Nintendo Game & Watch, their handheld console. The widescreen version means there was only 1 screen, whereas the Donkey Kong port had 2 screens. This one will only have 1. It features a single action button, as the original game did, but this time there are 4 directional buttons. So there is no directional pad this time around. It's actually more similar to what you'd see on a PlayStation controller than the D-pad that you'd come to expect from Nintendo in their NES controller. There are 2 tiers to the game. On the lower level, Junior can either run across the screen while trying to jump and avoid Snapjaws, or he can jump up and grab onto vines and try to swing across vines while trying to avoid the birds that are flying across the screen. When he gets to the end, he has to leap up to the top. And on the top tier, he can run across the floor and jump to the vines to avoid more Snapjaws. At the end, he must time his leap to grab a key and unlock his father. Each time, it only unlocks 1 section of the cage. He must end up completing this mission 4 times to finally unlock his father. So just like the previous Donkey Kong game, you must complete it 4 times to truly beat it. And finally, on December 16th, we're going to see the release of Greenhouse, another Game & Watch game. This game might seem like an odd inclusion to this list because it's going to lack both Mario and Donkey Kong, and there aren't any other Smash Brothers characters either, for that matter. Some will argue that this game includes Stanley, which is how we're going to treat this, as if the character is Stanley. But the reason that we're talking about it is it's the basis for the arcade game Donkey Kong 3 that's still to come. This game is a vertical Game & Watch. It has 2 screens, a top and a bottom. The main character Stanley comes armed with a bug spray, and the goal of the game is to keep bugs away from your plants. There's plants on the right and the left, on the top and the bottom, so essentially there are 4 groups of plants. You must try to get to where the bugs are by moving up and down, left and right, and shooting away the bugs before they kill your plants. Ultimately, this game operates like a true arcade game in which it just keeps going on and on and on as you try to collect as many points as possible, or until the bugs kill all of your plants and you get a game over. So there is no end goal or something to accomplish like we'd seen in the previous games, Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., but instead just trying to earn as many points as possible. Again, this game does not include any of our main characters, but it's going to serve as the basis for Donkey Kong 3, which if you tune in next week, we can learn more about. Greenhouse is going to wrap up 1982 for us, but before we end this, I want to talk about what's going on in the video game market at this point in time. American video game market has become very convoluted. The Atari 2600 was already in existence, and we saw Donkey Kong released on that. And beginning in November, the 5200 was also released by Atari, giving them 2 second-generation consoles available at stores. The Odyssey 2 was still on the market as well, and the Intellivision and ColecoVision, which we looked at in this episode, were still on store shelves. Meanwhile, the Japanese gaming market was still trying to figure out the home console market. And second-generation consoles finally made their way to the country. We see the Odyssey 2 and the Intellivision get released during the course of this year. Nintendo was still trying to work things out and still trying to become a household name. They did have first-generation consoles, but only in Japan. They had handheld consoles that were much more popular in Japan than they were in the United States. And their arcade games were becoming smash hits in both countries, but they were still trying to get their name out there. So join us next week as we look at these elements all come to a head in the very important 1983.